Everyone on that team had seen shootings. They'd breathed gunfire, they'd seen death. But this cracked something inside them. A seasoned sergeant broke down in tears in front of his partners, not from danger, not the gunshots, from what unfolded before their eyes. What they found, what they couldn't unsee, what was hidden in the quiet. Something about this case didn't make sense. Contradictions piled up fast, evidence pointing one way, but reality saying something else. A crime so tangled that the people sworn to solve it needed help themselves. Why? What did they uncover that left trained officers shaken, questioning everything? Nothing about this was normal or expected. Where do we even begin? Moscow, Idaho. A quiet college town. Tree-lined street, small storefronts, coffee shops. Campus life alive, early morning hours. November 13th, 2022, at 4 a.m. Routine quiet. Except this night, it didn't stay quiet. Inside an off-campus house, 4 University of Idaho students were killed. Stabbed in their sleep. Madison May Mogan, 21. Kaylee Jade Goncalves, 21. Zana Alexia Kernadel, 20. Ethan James Chapin, 20. All of them lived together. Friends, college life, future plans, gone, mass stabbing. Not some typical burglary gone wrong. This was something the investigators had never seen in Moscow before. Local police called it unusual. They'd responded to violent crimes. They'd handled tough scenes, but something about this hit differently because the victims didn't know the attacker. Now, according to law enforcement, the person charged, Brian Christopher Koberger, was a stranger to all 4 victims. That was rare. Mass murders of this type almost always involve people who knew each other. And when responding officers walked inside, there was more than shock. There was a lingering question. Why this house? Why these people? Why here? And that unanswered gap marked every step of the investigation. No warning, no apparent motive, no clear explanation. At first glance, it looked straightforward. The 911 call didn't start with panic. It started confused, late morning. 11:58 a.m. A call from the house on King Road. A surviving roommate reported someone unconscious. That's what dispatch heard first. Unconscious person. Routine classification. Medical response. Possible alcohol incident. College town. Weekend night. That's where the mind goes. Officers were sent for a welfare check. Not a homicide scene, not a mass killing, just a welfare check. Think about that for a second. When patrol units rolled out, they weren't bracing for what waited inside. They weren't calling for backup. They weren't putting on tactical gear. They expected confusion. Maybe intoxication. Maybe a medical emergency. That's what the radio suggested. But the information was already incomplete. According to later court documents, 2 surviving roommates had been inside that home for hours before the call was placed. One of them, Dylan Mortensen, would later tell investigators she heard sounds during the night. Crying. A voice saying, "It's okay, I'm going to help you." Then she saw a masked man walk past her and toward the sliding door. She locked herself inside her room and waited. Back to dispatch. The call classification did not match what officers would step into. There was no alert for multiple victims. No warning about a suspect who had already left. When the first Moscow Police Department officers arrived, it was daylight. Cold air. College houses close together. Cars parked outside. Nothing screaming emergency. The home itself, 3 stories, gray siding, balcony off the back, sliding glass door facing a wooded area. So normal from the outside. Completely still. That's the first anomaly. A house where 4 young adults lived. And not a single person came out to greet police. No movement in windows, no noise, just quiet. Officers walked up expecting to assess someone passed out. Instead, they discovered something else entirely. Inside, they found multiple victims. That moment changed everything. Radio traffic shifted. Tone changed. What began as a welfare check turned into a major crime scene in seconds. You can hear it in body cam footage later released. The pace tightens, the voices sharpen. Units begin requesting additional support. The perimeter expands. Medical responders are redirected. Now it's different. Now it's serious. Now it's urgent. Second anomaly. There were no obvious signs of forced entry at the front. No broken windows. No shattered door. Nothing that fit a typical home invasion pattern. Which raised the first real question. How did someone enter? And how did they leave? Humped. For the officers inside, the emotional shift wasn't just about scale. It was about proximity. These weren't gang rivals. Not a drug house. Not a known threat location. This was a rental full of college students, 20-year-olds, the kind of place officers drive past every day. Some of those responding officers had children around the same age. That connection hits hard. Training prepares you for danger. Doesn't prepare you for walking into a house that feels like your own kid's off-campus apartment. That realization stays with people. The scene was secured. Investigators were called in. The Idaho State Police joined. Then the FBI. What started as a local call was escalating fast. Before noon, it was clear this was one of the most serious crimes the city of Moscow had ever seen. And the initial classification, unconscious person, now felt almost surreal. How does a call begin that way and end here? Body cam footage, later reviewed by investigators, confirmed the quiet approach. No sirens blaring, no rush. Just officers walking into something they never expected. And once inside, there was no undoing it. Scenes like that don't fade easily. They stay. If you were that first officer, rolling up on a calm Sunday morning, what would you assume walking into this? Would you think medical emergency? Would you expect chaos? Or would you believe it was just another routine call? Because in Moscow, Idaho, on November 13th, 2022, routine lasted only a few seconds. So after that, everything changed. The house at 1122 King Road wasn't built like most homes. 3 levels, split entries, bedrooms tucked into corners, sliding glass door at the back. From the outside, it felt open. From the inside, layered. Investigators moved carefully. First floor, 2 surviving roommates' bedrooms, doors closed. Second floor, kitchen, living room, 1 bedroom. Third floor, 2 more bedrooms. At first glance, the layout explains how someone could move through without waking everyone. But then, something didn't match. Not the position. The condition. Police expected signs of chaos. Furniture overturned. Broken frames. Forced entry damage. Instead, much of the house looked normal. Kitchen counters still cluttered from the night before. Decorations on the walls. Shoes near the door. College life frozen mid-weekend. Detail. Not the sliding glass door at the rear of the house. Investigators later focused on that entry point. No smashed panels, no loud break. Contradiction. If someone entered that way, why wasn't there obvious disruption? Viewer thought. Would you assume someone inside knew the door wasn't secured, or that the suspect had studied the property? Upstairs. Madison Mogan and Kaylee Gonkovs shared a bed that night. Zana Kernadel and Ethan Chapin were in another room. 4 victims, 3 floors, yet 2 roommates survived downstairs. Detail. One surviving roommate, Dylan Mortensen, later told police she heard noises around 4 a.m. She thought it sounded like Kaylee playing with her dog. Then, she heard crying. And then a male voice. "It's okay, I'm gonna help you." Contradiction. If that voice came from the attacker, why use calm language? Viewer inference. Control. Confidence. A person who believed they had time. Another detail. A white Hyundai Elantra was seen on neighborhood surveillance footage around the time of the killings. It passed the home multiple times between 3:29 a.m. and 4:20 a.m., according to court records. Multiple passes, not random. Contradiction. If this was impulsive, why circle the block again and again? Viewer thought, that suggests observation. preparation. Inside the home, investigators found a tan leather knife sheath near one of the victims, stamped with a U.S. Marine Corps insignia. Detail: DNA was later recovered from the snap of that sheath. Contradiction: why leave the sheath but not the knife? Viewer inference: either something went wrong, or someone believed they were untouchable. Environmental clue. No immediate public report of forced confrontation outside. No neighbors reporting loud crashes. No broken windows alerting the street. The attack was contained within the structure. That containment unsettled officers because it meant proximity, close quarters, room to room, face to face. Officer behavior shifted, at first procedural, then methodical, then deeply focused. You could see it in how the perimeter expanded, how command presence increased, how state police and FBI agents arrived. This was no longer local. It was national. Something else didn't match. Brian Christopher Kohberger, later arrested in Pennsylvania, was a PhD student in criminology at Washington State University, just across the state line. On detail: he had studied criminal behavior. He had conducted surveys asking criminals how they felt while committing crimes, according to reporting after his arrest. Contradiction: why would someone studying crime allegedly commit one? Viewer inference: was this academic curiosity taken too far? Or something more personal? Phone data later showed Kohberger's device near the King Road residence at least 12 times before November 13th, according to the probable cause affidavit. 12 prior visits, not random, patterned. And then, the night of the murders, his phone stopped reporting location data for a window of time. Detail: airplane mode, powered off, contradiction. If someone plans carefully enough to disable tracking, why risk leaving DNA on a sheath? Officers reviewing the scene weren't just cataloging evidence. No, they were trying to reconcile two versions of the same story. Version 1, a chaotic rage killing. Version 2, calculated movement through a familiar layout. Both couldn't fully explain everything, and that tension sat heavy, not from what they saw alone, but from what the pieces implied. Because this wasn't just violence. It suggested study, observation, practice. I picture walking that hallway, dim light, closed doors, silence. Would you assume one attacker? Would you question how long they were inside? Would you wonder why two roommates were spared? These weren't small details. They shaped every decision moving forward. And for the officers inside that home, the scene wasn't just a crime to solve. It was a puzzle that refused to sit neatly in one box. Something didn't match, not the position, the condition. And the more they mapped the layout, the more complex it became. The first major break didn't come from a witness. It came from an object, small, ordinary at first glance, left behind. A tan leather knife sheath, found near Madison Mogan's body on the 3rd floor, according to the probable cause affidavit, stamped with a U.S. Marine Corps emblem. That detail mattered, because it suggested ownership, identity, connection. Investigators bagged it immediately. At first, it looked decisive. If the sheath belonged to the killer, it could tie a person directly to the scene. That's rare. Most violent offenders take the weapon with them. They don't leave personal items inches away from victims. This felt like a mistake, and mistakes solve cases. Forensic expectation was clear. If the sheath had been handled during the attack, it might hold touch, DNA, skin cells, sweat, trace material invisible to the eye. The Idaho State Police Lab processed it. Later, according to court records, a single source of male DNA was recovered from the snap button. Single source, not mixed, not layered with multiple contributors. Clean enough for analysis. That shifted the trajectory of the investigation, but then a contradiction. The DNA profile did not match anyone in local databases, not in Idaho, not in CODIS. No prior arrests. No criminal record linking that profile to known offenders, which forced a reclassification moment. This wasn't someone already in the system, not a repeat violent felon, not a familiar suspect. This was someone outside traditional law enforcement radar. So investigators turned to genetic genealogy. They used publicly available family tree databases to narrow possible relatives. Now, that process led them toward a family line in Pennsylvania. Eventually, Brian Christopher Kohberger, a PhD criminology student at Washington State University. 28 years old, living just across the Idaho border. The lab comparison later confirmed that the DNA on the sheath matched Kohberger's father at a statistical probability, indicating the sheath DNA belonged to a biological child of that father, which meant Brian Kohberger. On paper, that sounds airtight. DNA at the scene. Case closed. But evidence rarely works that cleanly. Here's where logic kicks in. If this were true, what else should exist? If someone physically attacked 4 people inside that home, there should be more DNA. Transfer on door handles, transfer in the vehicle, transfer on discarded clothing. Something. Yet early filings indicated the sheath DNA was the primary genetic link publicly disclosed. Not blood trails leading outside, not fingerprints covering surfaces. One object left behind. That forced investigators to consider 2 possibilities. 1, the suspect wore protective clothing and removed it afterward. 2, the suspect underestimated one small detail. The snap button, and here's another layer, cell phone data. According to the affidavit, Kohberger's phone was detected near the King Road residence at least 12 times for November 13th, 2022. Late night hours, early morning drives, frequent passes. If that were surveillance or if that were pre-planning, then the sheath wasn't random. It was part of a carried weapon system, which means preparation, which raises motive. Because people who act in sudden rage don't usually study a neighborhood over weeks. That suggests something internal, an idea, an obsession, a theory about control. Kohberger studied criminology. He had reportedly posted online surveys, asking criminals how they felt during offenses. That detail adds weight. Not proof of motive, but context. A man studying criminal minds, allegedly stepping into the role himself. Investigators had to ask, was this intellectual curiosity pushed into action? Was he testing his own understanding of crime? Or was there something more personal driving him? Because when you line up the sheath, the phone pings, the vehicle on surveillance, it forms a pattern. But patterns only matter if they align. If this were true, what else should exist? Stronger digital evidence, search history, communications, a clear link to one of the victims. And at that stage, publicly, those pieces were limited. It didn't erase the sheath. It didn't dismiss the DNA, but it complicated the narrative. And for investigators inside that command center, the case wasn't just about solving a crime anymore. It was about proving every link could withstand a courtroom. One object and one genetic trace. One suspect with no direct relationship to the victims. That's powerful and fragile at the same time. The sheath looked decisive. The lab confirmed identity. But evidence cluster 1 raised as many questions as it answered. And the deeper they went, the more they realized this wasn't just about what was found. It was about what was missing. And that absence carried weight. Before there was an arrest, before DNA linked a name, there was a voice in the dark. Dylan Mortensen. One of the 2 surviving roommates inside 112 King Road. Her account would become one of the most discussed elements in the entire case, because what she described didn't immediately match what the public expected. According to the probable cause affidavit, Dylan told investigators she woke up around 4 a.m. She thought she heard Kaylee Goncalves playing with her dog upstairs. Normal college house noise, thuds, movement. Nothing that screamed emergency. Then, she heard crying from Zana Kernodle's room and a male voice. "It's okay. I'm going to help you." That sentence stands out. Calm, measured, reassuring. Not aggressive, not frantic. Words aligned. Details didn't. If someone had just attacked 4 people, why use comforting language? Was it manipulation? An attempt to control the moment? Or was it directed at someone else entirely? Behavioral analysts often look at language during crimes. Tone reveals mindset. Short commands suggest urgency. Soft phrases suggest dominance through calm. That line implied control, confidence, a person who believed that they had authority in that moment. Yeah, let's say. Dylan said she opened her bedroom door 3 times, first time. After hearing what sounded like Kaylee, second time. After hearing crying, third time, she saw him. A masked man in black clothing, bushy eyebrows, walking toward the sliding glass door. She described standing in frozen shock. That phrase matters. Frozen. Shock. Fight or flight wasn't activated. Instead, stillness. It's trauma response, common, said documented. But when the timeline became public, many people questioned one thing. Why wasn't 911 called immediately? Because the emergency call wasn't placed until 11:58 a.m., nearly 8 hours later. Paid extension. Timeline claims. If the killings happened around 4 a.m. and the call came close to noon, what filled that gap? Police later clarified that surviving roommates summoned friends to the house before contacting emergency services. There were early reports of confusion about someone being unconscious, but confusion doesn't explain everything. So investigators had to reconcile statement versus scene. Words aligned, details didn't. Inside the home, evidence showed violence had occurred. 4 victims. Multiple floors, yet 2 roommates survived. No immediate chase, no forced entry reported by Dylan. Which raises a question. Did the suspect know which rooms to target? Or did he move floor to floor searching? Because if Dylan saw him walk past her, why was her room untouched? Behavioral observation suggests one possibility. Mission-focused offender. Target-specific. Not random. Another possibility, time constraint. Leave before daylight. Phone data later indicated Brian Kohberger's device disconnected from the network during the suspected time window. Then reconnected around 4:48 a.m. south of Moscow, which aligns with vehicle footage of a white Hyundai Elantra leaving the area. That consistency strengthens one side of the timeline, but it doesn't erase the emotional disconnect people felt reading Dylan's account. Some expected screaming. Others expected immediate panic. Instead, quiet, shock, silence. Plus, statement revisions also entered public discussion. Early police press releases described the attack as targeted, then clarified that the community was not at ongoing risk. That language shift created tension. Targeted how? Toward one person? The house? The occupants collectively? When wording changes, people notice. Language pattern flags. Even small shifts matter. Because in cases like this, every phrase is measured, and every phrase is interpreted. Behavioral analysts reviewing the suspect profile looked at Brian Kohberger's academic background. He studied criminology at Washington State University. He had completed graduate work in criminal justice at DeSales University. There were reports he asked former classmates about crime psychology. Some former acquaintances described him as socially distant. Others described him as intense. None of that proves motive, but it adds dimension. Because if someone studies criminal behavior for years, then allegedly commits one, that suggests more than impulse. It suggests internal narrative. Perhaps curiosity, perhaps resentment, perhaps a need to test theory against reality. Mental motive doesn't always show up in text messages. Sometimes it lives in isolation, in observation, in private rehearsal. Back inside the house, Dylan's description of the masked man included one specific physical trait: bushy eyebrows. That detail later aligned with Brian Kohberger's appearance, which strengthened the affidavit. Words aligned. Details didn't. Because even with that alignment, one element remained difficult. Why spare the roommates? If this was rage, why stop? If this was random, why selective? If this was personal, why no confirmed direct relationship? Each question layered on top of the last. Investigators weren't just comparing witness accounts to evidence. They were measuring human behavior against physical proof. What people say, what people do, what scenes reveal. And sometimes those three don't line up cleanly. In Moscow, Idaho, the witness statements provided a face, a voice, a movement down the hallway. But physical reality demanded more. Timestamps, DNA, surveillance footage, vehicle routes. It wasn't enough for words to align. Every detail had to hold. And at this stage, they didn't fully, which meant the investigation couldn't rely on a single narrative. It had to build one, piece by piece, until the gaps narrowed or widened.
By the end of that first day, the house on King Road was sealed. Crime scene tape, forensic tents, media trucks lining the street. But inside the Moscow Police Department, something else was happening. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, it was quiet, and it showed up in small ways. Long pauses in conversation, shorter tempers, officers sitting alone longer than usual. Veterans of the force, people who had worked fatal crashes, suicides, domestic homicides, were affected differently this time. Why? Because context matters. This wasn't a hardened criminal network. This wasn't gang retaliation. These were college students, 20 years old. Some officers had children that age. That parallel cuts deeper than people realize. You can train for violence. You cannot train away identification. Moscow is a small department, close-knit. Many officers knew families in the community. Some had responded to calls at that same residence before. Noise complaints, typical college house issues, familiar address, familiar setting, now transformed into a scene of mass homicide. That contrast alone can create cognitive shock. Normal environment, extreme outcome. The brain resists that pairing. Chief James Fry later spoke publicly about the toll the case took on his department. He described exhaustion. He described emotional strain. He acknowledged the pressure. And behind closed doors, departments often conduct internal debriefings after major incidents. Critical incident stress management, peer support sessions, confidential check-ins. These are not signs of weakness, they are protocols. Because trauma in policing does not always arrive with sirens, and sometimes it arrives hours later, in silence. What specifically caused distress here? Several factors. Number one, multiple victims in one location. That volume changes scene dynamics. Number two, youth of the victims. Number three, the prolonged uncertainty. 4 weeks after November 13th, there was no named suspect. Officers continued working daily patrols knowing the person responsible had not yet been arrested. That creates tension. You go home at night wondering if the same individual is still out there. Veteran officers often say uncertainty weighs heavier than confrontation. Because confrontation ends, uncertainty lingers. Comparison to prior cases matters. Moscow had not seen a quadruple homicide before. The scale alone shifted the emotional response. In larger cities, homicide units may encounter high case volume. In smaller communities, each major crime resonates more intensely. Officers don't compartmentalize as easily when they pass the street every day, when community members ask questions in grocery stores, when parents of students approach them directly. The human proximity increases impact. There was also the mental layer of the suspect profile. When Brian Kohberger was arrested in Pennsylvania on December 30th, 2022, and charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of burglary, another psychological element entered the picture. He was a criminology PhD student, studying criminal behavior, living just miles away. For investigators, that fact carries weight because it suggests calculation, planning, observation. Some officers reportedly expressed frustration at the idea that someone who studied investigative methods allegedly attempted to outmaneuver them. That intellectual challenge adds a different type of stress. It's not just about solving a crime, it becomes a test of professional competence, and that pressure accumulates. Cyril. Trauma indicators in first responders can include sleep disruption, irritability, intrusive thoughts, heightened alertness. Departments increasingly recognize these patterns. After high-impact cases, voluntary counseling resources are offered. Some officers accept, some decline. Culture is shifting, though. More agencies openly acknowledge mental health support because untreated stress compounds over time, and cases like this don't fade quickly. Another factor, media intensity, national coverage, around-the-clock commentary, speculation online. Officers working the case were not just managing evidence, they were navigating rumor control, false tips, public scrutiny. That amplifies strain. Every move is analyzed, every press conference dissected. That environment changes how a department feels internally. It tightens posture, it increases vigilance. Clinical reality. When a scene violates deeply held expectations about safety, especially in a community that considers itself low crime, responders experience what psychologists call moral stress. It's not about fear, it's about disruption of order. The belief that certain places are safe. When that belief is broken, it leaves residue, even among professionals. By the time the arrest warrant was served at the Koberger family home in Albrightsville, Pennsylvania, more than 6 weeks had passed. 6 weeks of evidence review, 6 weeks of community anxiety, 6 weeks of officers returning to that scene for follow-up processing. Repetition intensifies memory. Each return reinforces imagery, and imagery stays. This isn't about dramatizing their experience. It's about recognizing the human cost of sustained exposure to violent investigation. Police officers are trained observers, but they are still human beings, and in cases involving young victims, confined spaces, and unanswered motive, the psychological weight compounds. Some cases close, files archived. This one remained active. Court hearings, motions, national headlines. The work continued, and so did the internal processing. In interviews, Chief Fry thanked supporting agencies, Idaho State Police, the FBI, acknowledging the magnitude of the investigation. That collaboration helped distribute workload, but emotional impact doesn't distribute evenly, it settles individually. One officer may compartmentalize, another may replay the scene at night. There's no uniform reaction, only shared exposure. For the Moscow Police Department, November 13th, 2022 marked a before and after. Not just for the community, for the responders. Because once you walk through a door like that, you carry it, even when the tape comes down, even when the suspect is in custody. Some scenes stay filed in memory, and sometimes they require more than procedure to process. Before motive, before courtroom arguments, before national headlines, there is time. Time does not lie easily. Let's rebuild it, slowly, step by step. 2:44 a.m. Madison Mogan and Kaylee Goncalves arrive home at 1122 King Road after visiting a food truck downtown. Surveillance confirms it. Normal Saturday night. Nothing unusual in their behavior. They go upstairs, lights eventually off. 2:53 a.m. Zana Kernodle receives a DoorDash order. Receipt confirms delivery around this window. She is awake, active. Her phone shows TikTok usage close to 4:12 a.m., according to the probable cause affidavit. That matters, because it narrows the window. She wasn't asleep the entire time. 3:26 a.m. A white Hyundai Elantra is captured on surveillance footage near the King Road residence. The car passes the area once, then again, at multiple loops through the neighborhood. Split timeline graphic, left house activity, right vehicle movement. Red flag marker, Y circle, 3:29 a.m., 4:04 a.m. The Elantra continues making passes, slow, measured. Court documents later state that the vehicle appears to attempt parking or turning around near the residence. Not random traffic, deliberate movement. Let that settle. 4 a.m. Dylan Mortensen wakes up. She hears what she believes is Kaylee playing with her dog. Normal college house noise, nothing urgent. 4:04 a.m. Surveillance camera at a nearby residence captures distorted audio. Voices, a whimper, a loud thud, a dog barking repeatedly. This timestamp is critical because it aligns with movement outside. Zoom in contradiction marker. If the suspect entered before 4:04, what explains the audio spike at this moment? At 4:07 a.m. to 4:17 a.m. Dylan reports hearing crying from Zana's room. Then a male voice, "It's okay, I'm going to help you." She opens her door, sees a masked man walk past her toward the sliding glass exit. Black clothing, bushy eyebrows. He walks calmly. No rush, no visible panic. Overlap. Inside sighting. Outside vehicle movement. 4:20 a.m. The white Hyundai Elantra is seen leaving the area at a high rate of speed. That's documented in surveillance review. One direction, southbound, red flag marker, speed shift. Why accelerate now? 4:48 a.m. Cell phone data attributed to Brian Koberger reconnects to the cellular network south of Moscow, near Blaine, Idaho. Earlier during the estimated time of the killings, the phone shows no network activity. Gap, not airplane confirmation, not exact shutdown proof, but no connectivity. Or if the phone was off, why? If it was out of range, why return immediately after? Let that sit. 5:25 a.m. The same white Hyundai Elantra is seen traveling back toward Pullman, Washington, where Brian Koberger lived. Movement record aligns geographically, house to southbound to loop to return, split timeline graphic flashes again, left side. Inside house activity ends around 4:17, right side vehicle leaves 4:20, overlap tight window 9 a.m. to 11 a.m., no 911 call. Roommates remain inside, friends eventually arrive at the residence. Confusion about someone being unconscious. Details still debated publicly. But the official emergency call logs at 11:58 a.m., welfare check, officers dispatched, and by noon, the case shifts permanently. Now step back, what stands out? Phone silence during the estimated crime window, in vehicle looping the neighborhood multiple times, DoorDash delivery minutes before, surviving roommate encounter within the same time frame, 4 victims across 2 floors, short operational window, roughly 15 minutes, maybe less. If this were impulsive, why disable phone connectivity? If this were calculated, why leave a sheath, zoom in contradiction marker, 2 behaviors, one cautious, one careless, they collide, and there's another layer. Investigators later noted that Koberger's phone pinged near the King Road residence at least 12 times before November 13th. Late night hours, pre-event visits, add that to the timeline. Pattern before, action night, pattern after. According to the affidavit, the phone returned to the area around 9:12 a.m. on November 13th, after the killings. Why return? Curiosity, confirmation, compulsion. Yeah, mental motive begins to surface here. Sometimes offenders revisit scenes, not physically always, digitally, psychologically. They want to see reaction, they want to measure impact, they want to feel control. That's a known behavioral theme in criminal profiling literature, not proof, but context. Let's examine the compression. 3:29 a.m. Vehicle first pass, 4:20 a.m. Vehicle leaves area quickly, 51 minutes. Inside that window, entry. Movement through 3 floors, 4 victims. Exit. That's efficient. And efficiency suggests familiarity. either with layout or with objective. Would you be able to move through an unfamiliar house in darkness that quickly? Would you know which stairs lead where? Would you know which rooms to bypass? These aren't random questions. They define whether this was targeted or exploratory. One more contradiction: the sliding glass door, commonly used entry point in modern rentals. Easier access than front door. If that was the path, it required prior knowledge of structure, and surveillance footage shows repeated passes before approach, observation phase, then execution, then exit. The timeline does not show chaos. It shows sequence, which unsettled investigators. Because sequence implies thought, thought implies motive, and motive remained unclear publicly. Final timestamp: December 30, 2022. Brian Kohberger arrested in Albrightsville, Pennsylvania, 6 weeks after the killings. The timeline closes on one end, but inside that narrow 4 a.m. window, the most important minutes in Moscow's recent history unfolded, minute by minute, movement by movement, silence by silence. Time doesn't explain everything, but it narrows possibility. And in this case, the gaps are just as loud as the overlaps. Look at the split screen again. House on one side, car on the other, 2 tracks, running in parallel until they separate, and only one returns home. It wasn't just the knife sheath. It wasn't just the car. It was the phone. Because in 2022, almost no one moves through the world without leaving a digital shadow, and Brian Christopher Kohberger was no exception. Investigators pulled phone metadata tied to Kohberger's number through search warrants. Not message content at first, just the basics: timestamps, tower pings, connection logs. That data told a story before anyone read a single text. According to the probable cause affidavit, Kohberger's phone pinged cell towers near the King Road residence at least 12 times before November 13th. Late night hours, early morning windows, consistent pattern. That's not a one-time wrong turn, that's repetition. Red flag marker. Now look at November 13th itself. Between approximately 2:47 a.m. and 4:48 a.m., his phone shows no connection to cellular networks, no outgoing data, no incoming. Silence. Then Nasu. At 4:48 a.m., the device reconnects south of Moscow. Location drift. That matters, because it aligns with vehicle footage of the white Hyundai Elantra leaving the area at high speed around 4:20 a.m., 2 data streams, one physical, one digital, running parallel, then converging again. Here's where it gets more technical. Phones don't need to make calls to register movement. They constantly communicate with nearby towers. Even passive pings log approximate position. When that communication stops during a critical window, investigators take notice. Because if this were a coincidence, why does connectivity drop exactly during the suspected timeframe of the killings? Viewer reasoning moment. If someone wanted privacy during a specific act, what would they do? Airplane mode? Power down? Remove SIM card? The affidavit doesn't confirm which, but the absence itself becomes data. After 4:48 a.m., the phone shows travel consistent with a drive south into Idaho. Later, it returns toward Pullman, Washington. Then, another layer. At approximately 9:12 a.m. on November 13th, Kohberger's phone pings near the King Road residence again, hours after the crime. Why return? Curiosity, risk assessment, impulse. Mental motive surfaces here. Some behavioral analysts note that offenders sometimes revisit scenes, physically or digitally, to observe aftermath, to see emergency response, to relive the moment. It's not universal, but it's documented. And 9:12 a.m. falls before the 911 call at 11:58 a.m., which means if he was in the area, he may not have known the bodies had been discovered. That adds complexity. Let that settle. Now shift to message activity. Public filings have not detailed full text exchanges, but investigators did execute warrants for digital accounts. Google, Apple, cell provider records, cloud storage, standard protocol in homicide cases. When devices are seized, forensic analysts create a mirror image, bit-by-bit copies. They extract deleted content where possible. Text threads often linger in backup systems even after removal from the phone itself. Cloud sync artifacts, auto backup logs, notification previews cached in memory. Deletion doesn't always erase, which raises a natural question. If someone planned carefully enough to disable a phone during a specific window, would they also sanitize message history? If this were true, what else should exist? Search history, mapping queries. How? There's another digital angle. Vehicle. There's another digital angle. Vehicle data. Modern cars often store GPS fragments, Bluetooth pairings, infotainment logs. If Koberger's Hyundai Elantra connected to his phone regularly, that pairing creates overlap. Device duplication possibility, phone and car system syncing, timestamps aligning. If one device moves, the other often follows, which strengthens location reconstruction, unless one is intentionally separated. And that possibility matters, because if someone left their phone home during the crime, tower silence would look different. Instead, records suggest the device traveled, disconnected briefly, then reappeared. Or that pattern suggests deliberate interruption, not accidental loss of signal. Investigators also pulled historical data showing that Koberger's phone had been near the King Road residence multiple times in the months leading up to November. Late-night visits, short duration, return to Pullman, pattern behavior. If this were a random selection, why repeat visits? If this were personal, why no confirmed direct interaction between Koberger and the victims? No documented friendships, no shared classes, no obvious connection. Which brings us to the mental layer. Sometimes motive isn't rooted in relationship. Sometimes it's rooted in fixation, observation without engagement, study without introduction. A person can construct a narrative internally without the other party ever knowing, and digital breadcrumbs sometimes reveal that quiet buildup. Another reasoning prompt. Why remove only half the thread? If someone deletes messages selectively, why not remove all? If someone powers down a device, why bring it back online immediately after? Partial measures suggest either overconfidence or oversight. And overconfidence aligns with another detail. Koberger was studying criminology. He understood investigative process in theory, but theory and real-world execution are not the same. Leaving a sheath behind, disabling a phone during a narrow window, returning near the scene hours later. These actions create a digital contrast, careful in one area, loose in another, which unsettled investigators, because it suggested someone trying to outthink the system while still human enough to slip. And technology doesn't tell motive directly. It doesn't explain emotion. But it maps movement, and movement narrows possibility. In this case, the phone metadata didn't scream confession. It whispered pattern, repetition, silence at critical time, return afterward. And when layered with surveillance footage, DNA evidence, and witness accounts, the digital trail becomes harder to dismiss, but still, questions remain. Because digital footprints can show where someone was, they can't always show why, and motive, in this case, remains the most debated piece of all. At first, the suspicion stayed close to the house. That's normal. When 4 people are killed inside a shared residence, investigators start with proximity, roommates, friends, recent visitors, the inner circle. It's the most common path. Police initially described the attack as targeted. That single word changed public perception overnight. Targeted. How? One person? All 4? The house itself? That ambiguity redirected suspicion toward those who knew the victims best. Boyfriends were scrutinized, former partners examined, friends questioned repeatedly, phone records pulled, alibis checked. Nothing definitive. That was the first redirection. The assumption that someone close must be responsible began to thin. Words aligned, evidence didn't. Then came behavioral inconsistency. Online discussion erupted. Oh, why didn't the surviving roommates call 911 immediately? Why wait until 11:58 a.m.? Why summon friends first? Investigators clarified that a call was made reporting an unconscious person, but the delay lingered in public conversation. Speculation filled the silence. However, law enforcement stated early on that the surviving roommates were not believed to be involved. Their phones were reviewed, their movements documented. No physical evidence tied them to the attack. Public suspicion didn't match investigative findings. Another reframing moment. The circle widened. Then the vehicle announcement. December 7th, 2022. Moscow police publicly asked for information about a white Hyundai Elantra seen near the crime scene. That shifted everything, because now the focus wasn't emotional behavior, it was mechanical movement. Here, cars don't lie easily. Registration databases were checked. Washington State University campus records reviewed. One name surfaced: Brian Christopher Koberger, owner of a white Hyundai Elantra, registered in Pennsylvania, living in Pullman, Washington, just 8 miles from Moscow. Focus tightened, but not fully, because owning a car isn't guilt, it's proximity. Stilled red flag. Fait. Behavioral inconsistency deepened. Neighbors and former classmates described Koberger differently. Some said he was quiet, others described him as intense. There were reports of him being removed from a teaching assistant role at Washington State University weeks before his arrest due to alleged behavioral concerns, according to news coverage following his detention. That detail added dimension, not proof, but context. A person under stress, on academic pressure, isolation, internal frustration. Mental motive begins forming in fragments, not rage, not robbery, possibly something rooted in identity, in self-image, in control. Then the financial trace. When Koberger was arrested on December 30th, 2022 at his family home in Albrightsville, Pennsylvania, investigators seized items including a knife, black gloves, and other materials. Court filings later revealed that Koberger had purchased a K-bar-style knife and sheath months earlier through online retailers. Purchase history matters because it connects planning to action. It suggests pre-acquisition. If someone buys a weapon months in advance, and then that type of sheath appears at a homicide scene, the narrative shifts again, planning over impulse, deliberation over chaos. Relationship conflict layer. Despite heavy online theories, no confirmed romantic or personal relationship between Koberger and the victims has been publicly established. No shared classes, no documented friendships, no public social media exchanges confirmed by investigators, which complicates motive. If there was no relationship, why those four? Investigators explored whether one of the victims may have been observed at a workplace. Madison Mogan and Kaylee Goncalves worked at a local restaurant. Zana Kerndl had her own circle. Ethan Chapin was visiting that night. Still, no formal link announced. That absence reframed belief again. This wasn't a jealous ex, not a known dispute. Something else. Hidden connection reveal. Phone data showed Koberger's device near the King Road residence at least 12 times prior to November 13th. Late nights, short durations, and that suggests observation, study, familiarization, which introduces a different type of motive. Not personal grievance, not financial gain, possibly fascination, control, experimentation. Koberger studied criminology. He reportedly conducted surveys asking people who committed crimes how they felt during those acts. That detail resurfaced after his arrest. It doesn't prove motive, but it shapes profile. A person interested in criminal psychology, allegedly stepping into the role of offender, may be driven by internal narrative. Testing theory, challenging self-perception, seeking dominance. These are hypotheses investigators consider when evidence doesn't show obvious conflict. Each step redirected belief. First, someone close, then vehicle owner, then DNA match, then phone pattern, then weapon purchase. Every layer tightened, but none alone was enough. Together, they formed a ladder. And as each rung locked into place, public doubt narrowed. Yet motive remained partially hidden. Why this house? Why this night? Why these victims? Financial gain doesn't fit. Personal revenge hasn't been demonstrated publicly. Random thrill doesn't explain repeated pre-visits. That leaves a psychological frame, control, observation turned action, an internal script playing out, focus shifts, quietly. For weeks, the case felt suspended. National headlines, daily press conferences, no arrest. Inside the Moscow Police Department, investigators weren't standing still. They were rebuilding the case from every angle, over and over. Because sometimes the breakthrough doesn't come from something new. It comes from looking at the same detail differently, same detail, new meaning. The method that unlocked the stalled investigation wasn't dramatic, it was systematic. Thousands of white Hyundai Elantras were registered across the country, so law enforcement narrowed the field, year range 2011 to 2013. Color white, proximity, Pullman, Washington, and surrounding areas. Washington State University Police conducted a database search of vehicles registered on campus. One result stood out: Brian Christopher Koberger, white Hyundai Elantra, registered in Pennsylvania, address Pullman, 8 miles from Moscow. That discovery didn't confirm guilt, but it shifted the focus sharply, because now the vehicle in surveillance footage had a potential owner, same detail, new meaning. Cross-department input intensified. Idaho State Police, FBI Behavioral Analysis Unit, digital forensics teams, genetic genealogy specialists, each brought a different lens. The FBI assisted in analyzing cell tower data, mapping movement patterns, cross-referencing timestamps, pattern recognition moment. Vehicle loops the neighborhood before 4 a.m., phone disconnects during critical window, phone reconnects south of Moscow, vehicle returns toward Pullman. When those pieces aligned visually on a map, the pattern became harder to dismiss. It wasn't just proximity, it was sequence. Oh, what then the overlooked clue resurfaced? The knife sheath, originally processed for DNA, but investigators revisited it again, not just as genetic evidence, as behavioral evidence. Why leave it? Was it dropped in haste or forgotten? If someone brought a weapon prepared with a sheath, that suggests planning. If they left it, that suggests either disruption or overconfidence. Analyst insight emerged here. Offenders who believe they understand investigative procedure sometimes underestimate small physical traces. They focus on large precautions, like disabling a phone, and overlook minor contact points, same detail, new meaning. Another shift came from surveillance review. Early footage showed the Elantra passing the house several times. Later, analysis narrowed down specific time frames, speed variations, turn signals, brake lights. How lost drivers hesitate randomly. Searchers, lost drivers hesitate randomly. Searchers move with intent. Let that sink in. Then came the decision to re-interview. Investigators gathered more information about Koberger's academic history. Former classmates at DeSales University described him as highly focused on criminology, intense, curious about how criminals think. At Washington State University, reports surfaced that he had faced internal issues as a teaching assistant, allegations of confrontations with faculty, possible academic pressure. While not criminal evidence, those factors contributed to a broader profile. Internal tension, isolation, identity wrapped around intellectual mastery. And when someone builds their sense of self around understanding crime and then allegedly commits one, that becomes psychologically relevant. Re-interview strategy shifted. Investigators prepared to question not just movement, but mindset, The final momentum spike came quietly. December 2022, law enforcement tracked Koberger traveling cross-country with his father to Pennsylvania. Vehicle observed, DNA opportunity presented. Trash collection outside the family home, covert retrieval. Lab comparison. The DNA from the trash matched Koberger's father. Statistical analysis indicated the sheath DNA likely belonged to a biological child of that man, which meant Brian Kohberger. Probability overwhelming, same detail, new meaning. Now the sheath wasn't just trace evidence, it was identity. Arrest warrant issued December 30th, 2022. Kohberger taken into custody in Albrightsville, Pennsylvania. No resistance reported. Extradited back to Idaho. Charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of burglary. Momentum shifted overnight, from theory to named suspect to courtroom for folk. But even with the breakthrough, questions remained. Why that house? Why those individuals? No confirmed personal relationship, no financial motive, no clear argument documented, which returns us to mental motive. Possibly fascination, possibly control. In this case, the pattern wasn't chaotic. It was layered. Deliberate movement, digital silence, repeated visits, weapon acquisition, same detail, new meaning. On the case that once felt scattered began forming a single line, from surveillance camera to cell tower to DNA snap to arrest. And in that shift, the investigation crossed from uncertainty into confrontation, not just with a suspect, but with motive. And motive here still resists simple explanation.
The arrest made headlines, but it didn't bring relief the way people expected. Because when Brian Christopher Kohberger was taken into custody, 4 families were still waking up without their children. Madison Mogan's father, Ben Mogan, spoke publicly about his daughter's warmth, her laugh, her independence. Kaylee Goncalves' family demanded transparency. They attended hearings. They gave interviews. They pushed for answers. Zana Kernodle's mother described her daughter as strong and loyal. Ethan Chapin's siblings stood beside their parents in court. 4 separate homes, 4 separate dining tables, empty chairs. That reality doesn't change when a suspect is named. It just shifts the questions. Why them? Why that night? For the families, court proceedings became a new form of endurance. Bond hearings, status conferences, motions to dismiss. Legal language replacing human grief. Every filing dissected. Every update analyzed. Justice moves slowly. Grief does not. And that gap creates strain. Inside the Moscow Police Department, the arrest brought confirmation. But it also brought pressure, because now everything would be tested in court. Every affidavit line, every timestamp, every piece of collected evidence. Officers who walked through that house now had to revisit it through testimony. Photos reviewed, diagrams presented, memories recalled under oath. That re-exposure can reopen emotional strain. You move forward, then you're pulled back, over and over. There's another layer here. Moral strain. When officers investigate crimes involving young victims, especially in small communities, it affects how they see their own environment. Moscow, It challenges the assumption of security, not abstractly, personally. And when Brian Kohberger's academic background became widely known, that added a different dimension. A criminology PhD student, someone studying criminal behavior, allegedly committing a crime he should understand deeply. That fact unsettled many observers, including law enforcement, because it suggests awareness, preparation, an attempt to navigate investigative blind spots. That intellectual confrontation carries its own weight. Internal conflict surfaced in quieter ways. Officers had to reconcile 2 realities. 1, their duty to remain objective. 2, their human reaction to what they saw. You can't let emotion drive evidence collection. But you also can't erase emotion entirely. Balance becomes critical, especially in a case this visible. Trust collapse extended beyond the families. In communities, fear spreads quickly. Students question their safety. Parents question the university. Residents questioned whether the threat was truly isolated. Even after police said there was no ongoing danger, When the suspect turned out to be living just across the state line in Pullman, Washington, the idea of proximity hit harder. He wasn't a drifter passing through. He was nearby. That realization changes perception of neighbors, of routine, of normal life. Partnership fallout followed. Universities re-examined housing policies. Law enforcement agencies reviewed interagency communication protocols. Discussions about surveillance cameras, lighting, and response strategies intensified. Not because something was done incorrectly, but because when tragedy happens, systems get reassessed. It's automatic, it's institutional self-examination, and it can strain relationships while improvements are negotiated. For Bryan Kohberger's own family, the emotional weight fell differently. His parents reportedly expressed shock through their attorney after his arrest. They cooperated with authorities. They watched their son's name move across national news. Two narratives unfolding at once: victims' families grieving loss, a suspect's family facing disbelief. That duality complicates emotion. In court, Kohberger stood silent during early hearings, expression controlled. Posture steady, no public outburst, no dramatic confession, just procedure. And that restraint amplified tension, because when emotion isn't visible, people project onto it. Was there remorse? Was there detachment? The public doesn't know, but speculation grows in silence. For investigators, the pivot wasn't just legal, it was psychological. The case shifted from who did this to can we prove it beyond doubt. That shift changes posture. You stop searching broadly, you narrow sharply, you anticipate defense strategies, you fortify weak points. That's when the weight deepens, because one overlooked detail can undo months of work. Families continue to attend hearings, photographs displayed, memories shared outside the courthouse. 4 young lives summarized in legal briefs. It's clinical on paper, but human in reality. And that contrast between file number and lived experience is what keeps this case heavy. One line captures the pivot. This changed the case, not because a suspect was identified, but because every person connected to it, families, officers, community, crossed from uncertainty into confrontation. And confrontation is not closure, it's just the next chapter. The emotional toll doesn't vanish at arrest, it evolves into testimony, into waiting, into the long process of justice moving forward. And for many involved, the memory of that house on King Road remains not as headlines, but as something personal. For weeks, the country watched a mystery unfold. 4 students, 1 quiet college town, no suspect named. Then, December 30th, 2022, Bryan Christopher Kohberger is arrested in Albrightsville, Pennsylvania. Charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of burglary. That was the moment everything shifted. But the shift wasn't what many expected, because the reveal didn't confirm a jealous ex. It didn't confirm a drug dispute. It didn't confirm a fight that got out of control. It confirmed something else. Criminology PhD student, 28 years old, studying criminal behavior at Washington State University, living 8 miles from the crime scene. That detail alone changed the narrative. The unexpected responsible party type. Not someone embedded in the victim's social circle. Not someone with a documented personal conflict. A stranger, allegedly. And that collapsed one of the earliest public theories. That this had to be personal in the traditional sense. Investigators confirmed through the probable cause affidavit DNA recovered from a knife sheath found at the scene matched Bryan Kohberger through genealogical comparison. His cell phone had pinged near the King Road residence at least 12 times before November 13th. Surveillance footage captured a white Hyundai Elantra consistent with his vehicle circling the neighborhood. His phone disconnected during the window of the murders, then reconnected afterward. Piece by piece, pattern by pattern, the theory of an inside dispute fell away. What replaced it was more unsettling. Targeted, yes, but not because of known friendship. Targeted possibly through observation, through study, through repetition, which introduces a deeper contradiction. If someone studies crime professionally, why leave behind a sheath? If someone disables a phone to avoid tracking, why return near the scene hours later? Careful in one move, careless in another. Method contradiction. That duality complicates the picture, because it suggests not just planning, but overconfidence, or an internal narrative that didn't account for small human error. Investigators did not publicly establish a confirmed motive, and that absence leaves room for complexity. There is no documented feud, no financial incentive, no public record of threats. So what drives a person to allegedly enter a home at 4 a.m. and kill 4 strangers? Mental motive becomes central. Some behavioral analysts suggest fascination can evolve into fixation, observation into rehearsal, rehearsal into action. When someone builds identity around understanding criminal behavior, there can be a dangerous intersection between theory and ego. If control becomes the objective, if proving intellectual dominance becomes the goal, then the act isn't about the victims personally. It's about the internal script. But that's analysis, not confirmed fact. Because in court, motive must be supported by evidence, and as of now, the full motive has not been publicly detailed by prosecutors. That's the open angle. Why this house? Why these 4 individuals? Why that specific night? Even with DNA, surveillance, phone metadata, one question lingers. What was happening inside Brian Kohberger's mind in the months leading up to November 13th? And because without motive clearly established, the case remains partially unresolved in the public imagination. Legally, there is a named suspect. Procedurally, the evidence has been presented in filings. But emotionally and psychologically, the full explanation remains incomplete. The reveal answered who. It didn't fully answer why. And that gap, nestaru, that space between action and reason, is where this story still holds its tension. An arrest is not a conviction. It's the beginning of a different process. On January 5, 2023, Brian Christopher Kohberger appeared in court in Latta County, Idaho. He was formally charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder, 1 for Madison Mogan, 1 for Kaylee Goncalves, 1 for Zana Kernodle, and 1 for Ethan Chapin, plus 1 count of burglary. The burglary charge alleges unlawful entry into the King Road residence with intent to commit a felony. That matters, because it frames the event as planned entry, not accidental presence. At his arraignment in May 2023, Kohberger stood silent. Under Idaho law, when a defendant refuses to enter a plea, the judge enters a plea of not guilty on their behalf. That's what happened. Not guilty. Which means the burden now sits entirely on the prosecution, beyond a reasonable doubt. Every element, every count. Court developments followed quickly. A gag order was issued early in the process, limiting what attorneys, investigators, and family members could say publicly. The goal was clear: protect the integrity of the trial, avoid jury contamination. High-profile cases bring intense media attention, and this case had national reach, from Idaho to Pennsylvania, from campus communities to primetime news. From the defense position has been measured. Kohberger's public defender, Ann Taylor, has emphasized the presumption of innocence, standard but critical. In filings, the defense has challenged certain aspects of evidence collection, including questions surrounding genealogical DNA methods. That's significant. So because the DNA recovered from the knife sheath was linked to Kohberger through investigative genetic genealogy, a developing forensic tool. Legal teams often scrutinize emerging science. Chain of custody, statistical probability, laboratory handling. Those challenges don't mean the evidence fails. They test it. That's the process. And evidence weight is layered. The prosecution's case, based on publicly available court documents, includes DNA on the sheath snap, cell phone tower data showing presence near the residence multiple times before November 13th, phone connectivity gap during the suspected crime window, surveillance footage of a white Hyundai Elantra matching Kohberger's vehicle, vehicle movement consistent with the timeline of the killings. Individually, each element can be argued. Together, they create cumulative weight. That's how complex cases are built, not on one dramatic reveal, but on stacking probabilities. There have been pre-trial motions regarding venue change, concerns about jury impartiality, arguments over discovery materials, debates about what evidence may be admissible. All expected in a case of this magnitude. The judicial system moves carefully in capital cases, and this is one. Latah County prosecutors announced they intend to seek the death penalty if Kohberger is convicted. That decision raises stakes significantly because capital cases require additional procedural safeguards, expanded jury selection, mitigation phases, mental health evaluations. The timeline extends. As of now, there has been no verdict, no sentencing. The case remains pending trial. Court dates have shifted as attorneys prepare. Discovery continues. Expert witnesses retained. Forensic analysis reviewed by both sides. This phase is deliberate because once a verdict is reached in a capital case, appeals often follow. Years of litigation can extend beyond the initial judgment. Analytically, this is where the story stands. 4 victims, 1 charged defendant. A case built on digital data, genetic evidence, surveillance footage, and behavioral reconstruction. No publicly confirmed motive presented in court filings yet, no confession. No plea agreement announced. Which means the courtroom will be where narrative meets proof, and proof must withstand scrutiny. In high-profile prosecutions, perception and evidence often diverge. Public opinion forms quickly, but jurors are instructed to consider only admissible evidence presented during trial. And that distinction matters, because headlines are not verdicts. Affidavits are not final judgments. They are foundations, tested later under cross-examination. The legal outcome layer, at this stage, remains open. Brian Christopher Kohberger is presumed innocent under U.S. law until proven guilty. The charges are serious. The potential penalties severe. The families wait. The defense prepares. The prosecution organizes. And the court system advances methodically. No rush, no shortcuts. Because in a case involving 4 counts of first-degree murder, the margin for errors is 0. And the next chapter will unfold not in press conferences, but in a courtroom. Long after the arrest, long after the headlines slowed, the impact stayed. Not just in Moscow, across departments, across campuses, across training rooms. Because when a case exposes gaps, agencies respond, quietly, deliberately. First, communication. Moscow Police Department increased structured briefings with partner agencies. Clearer interagency coordination protocols, faster data sharing, university police and city police reviewing response thresholds for off-campus housing. Not because something failed publicly, but because large cases test systems, and tested systems get refined. Second, surveillance review. Neighborhood camera canvassing became more structured. Standardized grid searches. Earlier requests for community footage. What used to take days now happens within hours. Then investigators across the country watched how the white Hyundai Elantra was tracked. Vehicle recognition became a teaching point. Pattern recognition, movement loops, time compression, same tools, sharpened use. Third, digital forensics expansion. Phone metadata analysis. In this case, showed how powerful passive tower pings can be. Agencies updated training modules to emphasize geofence warrants. Cloud recovery, data preservation letters issued earlier in investigations. Because digital silence can be as meaningful as digital activity. Same detail, new emphasis. Fourth, mental health protocols. Chief James Fry publicly acknowledged the strain on his officers. That acknowledgement matters. After high-impact cases, departments increasingly normalize voluntary counseling. Peer support teams activated sooner. Critical incident debrief sessions scheduled automatically, not optionally. No stigma language, just routine. Because repeated exposure accumulates. Even when officers stay composed in public. One investigator paraphrased in later interviews, said something close to this. You can process evidence. You can't always process what you see as easily. Short sentence, heavy meaning. Sir. Training academies also began referencing the case in discussion blocks, not about sensational detail, about investigative layering, how surveillance, DNA, and phone data intersect, how early public language, like the word targeted, shapes perception. Communication discipline became a lesson. Precision matters. Every phrase carries weight. University housing offices nationwide reviewed safety practices, lighting audits, door security reminders. Late-night ride programs expanded. Parents asked more questions. Students became more aware. Not panic, adjustment. There was also professional reflection on investigative patience. For weeks, no arrest was made. Speculation surged online. Rumors spread. But law enforcement continued collecting, testing, verifying. One senior official later paraphrased the mindset this way. Pressure doesn't speed science. It just makes you more careful. Measured approach. Resisted rush. That discipline preserved evidentiary strength. Another shift. Public expectation of transparency. High-profile cases now demand frequent updates. But this case showed the tension between transparency and trial protection. The gag order limited commentary. Some families expressed frustration, others supported caution. Law enforcement agencies nationwide observed that balance. Community trust requires information. Court integrity requires restraint. Navigating both is now a core leadership challenge. And then there's the personal aftermath. For investigators who walked into 1122 King Road that morning, the address doesn't disappear. Even after the house itself was demolished in December 2023 by the University of Idaho. Physical structure gone. Memory remains. That demolition symbolized closure for some. For others, it marked how permanent loss becomes part of landscape. Professionally, this case will likely be studied for years, not because of spectacle, but because of integration. Genetic genealogy, surveillance mapping, cell data interpretation, interstate coordination, small department, national case. That combination reshaped training conversations, short lines, clear lessons. Technology matters, language matters, mental resilience matters. The legal process continues. Families wait. Officers return to routine calls, traffic stops, noise complaints, medical assists. But experience changes perspective. Every department has a before and an after. For Moscow Police, November 13th, 2022 draws that line. Quiet town. 4 victims. 1 suspect charged. An investigation built layer by layer, and a profession reminded that even in places considered safe, complexity can surface without warning. Measured response is the only path forward. And that lesson stays, even with an arrest, even with DNA, even with surveillance footage. Some questions refuse to settle, and that's where this case still lives, in the space between proof and explanation. Start with motive. As of the latest public filings, prosecutors have not presented a detailed motive in open court. No manifesto released, no confirmed personal dispute, no financial gain. So what drove Brian Christopher Kohberger, according to the charges, to allegedly enter 1122 King Road? There are fragments, academic focus on criminology, reported prior visits near the house, late-night driving patterns, but fragments are not full explanations. And without a clear motive laid out publicly, interpretation fills the gap. Next, targeting. Were Madison Mogen, Kaylee Goncalves, Zana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin specifically selected? Or was the house itself the focus? Investigators initially used the word targeted. Later clarifications narrowed that statement. Some believe one individual may have been the primary focus. Others believe the location mattered more than the occupants. Court documents have not conclusively resolved that distinction, which leaves room for debate. Scroll, another unresolved layer. The surviving roommates. Dylan Mortenson's account is documented in the probable cause affidavit. She described seeing a masked man walk past her, yet she was unharmed. Why? If the suspect moved through the house deliberately, why stop when he did? Time constraint, objective completed, unplanned interruption? Multiple interpretations exist, none officially confirmed beyond the affidavit description. Disputed interpretations also center on digital data. The phone disconnect window. Defense attorneys may argue alternative explanations. Network gaps can occur for reasons unrelated to deliberate shutdown. Tower coverage varies. Signal strength fluctuates. Experts may disagree on inference. In court, those technical nuances matter. Small detail, big consequence. Then there's the knife sheath. DNA recovered from the snap is central evidence. But the defense has indicated it will scrutinize investigative genealogy methods, chain of custody, statistical probability language. Experts may debate how conclusively that DNA places Kohberger inside the house at the moment of the crime. Prosecution will argue cumulative weight. Defense may argue isolated trace, same evidence, different framing. Alternate theory fragments surfaced early in the case. Online speculation ranged widely. The multiple perpetrators, drug-related angles, secret relationships. Most of those have not been supported by official filings. But the internet doesn't forget early narratives. And once planted, alternative theories persist in public discussion, even when unsupported. There is also the question of psychological profile. Was this an act driven by fixation, by intellectual challenge, by resentment, or something else entirely? Behavioral experts often disagree in high-profile cases. Some emphasize control dynamics, others focus on isolation patterns. Still others caution against overinterpreting academic background. Studying criminology does not equal criminality, and courts require evidence, not theory. That distinction remains critical. Another open angle, the return near the scene at approximately 9:12 a.m., here according to cell records. Why return? Curiosity, routine travel, route, coincidence. Two explanations remain. Either the return was intentional, or it was unrelated to the crime itself. And without direct statement from the accused, that interpretation stays contested. Even the demolition of the King Road house in December 2023 created discussion. Some families supported removal, others questioned timing. Symbolism matters. Physical spaces carry meaning. When a structure disappears, some see closure, others see erased history. Different perspectives, same event. And then there's the biggest uncertainty of all. What will happen in court? Will the evidence hold under cross-examination? Will jurors interpret digital data the same way investigators did? Will expert testimony clarify motive or complicate it further? Until a verdict is reached, these angles remain active, not as rumor, as legal possibility. 4 lives were lost. A suspect stands charged. The investigation has been mapped in detail, yet motive remains partially undefined in public record. And when motive is unclear, discussion continues. That's human nature. We want explanation, not just identification. So as the case moves toward trial, one question still hangs over everything. Was this about a specific person, or about an internal narrative playing out in someone else's mind? 2 explanations remain, and the courtroom will decide which one survives. 4 students: Madison Mogan, Kaylee Goncalves, Zana Kernodle, Ethan Chapin. 1 house on King Road in Moscow, Idaho. 1 suspect charged, Brian Christopher Kohberger. DNA on a knife sheath. Cell phone data with a critical gap. A white Hyundai Elantra circling in the dark. 12 prior late-night visits near the residence. A return hours later, layer by layer, digital, physical, behavioral. But motive still waits for courtroom clarity. And that's where this story pauses. Not finished, just paused. When you look at the full timeline, what changed your view the most? Was it the sheath with the DNA snap? Was it the phone disconnect during the 4 a.m. window? Was it the repeated vehicle passes before entry? Or was it the reported prior visits to the area? Because each piece alone can be argued. Together they build weight. But weight is interpreted. Did investigators pivot at the right moment? When the white Hyundai Elantra was publicly announced, attention shifted sharply. When genealogical DNA entered the case, focus narrowed further. Was that sequencing precise? Or could earlier digital analysis have accelerated the arrest? Looking back with full information is easy. Working in real time is different. And one more layer. If you were reviewing this file from the beginning, what detail would you re-examine? The timeline compression between 4:04 a.m. and 4:20 a.m.? The 9:12 a.m. return near the house? The language used in early press conferences? The absence of a confirmed public motive? Because sometimes cases are solved legally, but debated socially. As this moves toward trial, the courtroom will test every conclusion. Defense will challenge interpretation. Prosecution will reinforce pattern. Experts will disagree, jurors will weigh probability, and the families will wait. That is where this story stands. Charged, not yet decided. In the end, this case forces a difficult reflection on safety, on assumption, on how quickly routine can shift. It challenges belief in familiarity. It tests investigative precision. It reminds professionals that evidence must withstand scrutiny. And it reminds communities that explanation does not always arrive immediately. Some cases end in court. Others stay with the people who saw them.